A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. We read that in Proverbs, and I bet you've heard that saying, and it's right out of the Bible. And in a world where every jogger on the trail wears a Fitbit of some sort, why don't we wear something that checks our fitness with our tongue? After all, the tongue is a muscle that we exercise all day, and did you know that it's not the strongest muscle in our body, but it's the most flexible, and we can never experience fatigue when using it? So apples of gold and settings of silver, why that picture of the spoken word? So glad you asked. This devotional is all about the words that roll off of our tongues at the most opportune or inopportune time. So this first devo is called Important Words. From Exodus 19, when God gives Moses the 10 Commandments, we read that God first spoke to Moses about the words he was going to give him, and he mentioned a few important things. He was going to remind the people of how God had carried them on eagle's wings, and he said to tell them if they obeyed God's words, then they will be his treasured possession, and although the entire earth belongs to God, the people will be his holy nation. They were words that reminded, instructed, and gave hope to the listeners, and this was important for Moses to say to the people. So we read that the people agreed and sent a response back to God and said they unanimously agreed that they would do everything the Lord said, and Moses told God this response. So there's this directive from God, words to his people, and a response back. And it's then they get their first big word of instruction, the 10 Commandments, those important words from God of how to live on the earth. Those 10 Commandments, the most important words God was speaking to his people, words of life to ensure the hearers and doers of a life pleasing to their God. God often speaks to us through our lives words of hope and remembrance and instruction, and often our ears perk up when there's a blessing in those words. But these words coming from the mountain in the 10 Commandments also had strict warnings, and they established the relationship between God and his people and had strong direction. So for 40 days, Moses was up on that mountain, and of course the people grew tired of waiting, and no longer were these important word promises enough to sustain their obedience. So we read in chapter 32 how they lost heart and fashioned a calf, and it said that the gods that they fashioned were the gods that brought them out of Egypt. Yikes. Remember, God had told them that he had carried them on eagle's wing, and they had responded back to Moses and said they would do everything God said. And now, less than 40 days later, the people are giving the praise to the fashioned idols from their own hands for bringing them out of slavery. So in a matter of days, they had forgotten the important words, and they opted for words that they crafted for themselves. Moses went back to God and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They've made themselves gods of gold." Important words were given from God's mouth, and they were words of remembrance and truth. A covenant of sort was made. And because of impatience, the people turned on a dime and created a god with their hands. And they had the audacity to offer praise to that God for what the only true God had done. So this first devotional is to note where our help comes from in life, and that's from God and him alone, and his words are important and life-giving. It's a stern reminder and warning that God's promises are true, and his hand and right arm are the sustainer of our days and our walk from any sort of slavery into freedom. When we forget that, and when we grow impatient and waiting, then we create false gods, anything made with our own hands, success, achievement, status, and wealth, lofty thoughts. And we end up placing ourselves in what we've got in our own hands, i.e. the gold that the people gathered and made a calf, and we place God's words below our own. Maybe we think, well, I've never done that, but we do when we entertain thoughts that are anything contrary to what God has already done in our lives, and when we decide to disobey the words of life he has given us, or we grow impatient and decide to look elsewhere to be sustained. So let's remind ourselves that it's God who has carried us on eagle's wings out of death into life, and how those who put their trust in him will never be ashamed, and we are his treasured possession, and that he alone has the words of life, important words, from God's mouth to our ears, and there's no other source of life but what God says about himself, us, and others. It's all there, the important words.